way of some housekeeping, after we've heard from each of the speakers, we hope to have some time for question and answers from you, the audience. If you would like to ask questions or have comments, please ask them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom application, and we will pose a selection of those to the panel if there's time. So with that, I would like to turn to Catherine Wenger, who's a partner at Wenger Law, specializing in international and European climate law and policy. She's also a former negotiator for adaptation and loss and damage for Norway. Catherine will be giving a short presentation to summarize the key outcomes from COP28 on loss and damage. Catherine, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to Carver for the kind introduction. And also, thank you for providing this space for discussing loss and damage finance, one of the key ingredients for ensuring an equitable and a fair global response to climate change now and for the next century. The COP28 decision on loss and damage was historic for several reasons. First, it was adopted at the opening plenary of COP28, which in itself is a testament to both the hard work of the Transitional Committee and the parties' willingness to move forward on loss and damage finance. Second, it decided to operationalize the Loss and Damage Fund and the funding arrangements, long seen as an impossibility under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement regime. And finally, the UAE COP28 presidencies became historic by being the first non-Annex 1 country to pledge to the Loss and Damage Fund, which received pledges of $661 million in total. The COP28 decision operationalized the Loss and Damage Fund by approving the governing instrument of the fund, establishing a new dedicated and independent secretariat, establishing a board with a slight majority for developing country parties, and ensure that the fund is hosted by the World Bank for an interim period of 4 years, given it can conform with the requirements set out in the decision. Further, the decision established funding arrangements for mobilizing new and additional resources and enhancing existing resources of finance under and outside of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. As such, the fund was tasked with holding an annual high-level event with 30 representatives involved with financing for loss and damage. The dialogue will result in a report with recommendations to be provided to the COP CMA for consideration. Next slide, please. With operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund as an operating entity of the financial mechanism of both the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, the architecture of the Watershed International Mechanism is complete. It has a policy component, the WIM Executive Committee, a technical component, the Santiago Network, and now it also has a financing component with the loss and damage funding arrangements and the fund. The focus going forward will be to ensuring that these components work well together in a coordinated and effective way with focus on implementation. However, the following must be in place before money can flow to the fund. The arrangements for the fund, to be drafted by the Standing Committee on Finance, will need to be approved by COP29 and CMA6 in November this year. The World Bank and the board of the fund will need to agree on a hosting agreement by August this year. The fund will need to be set up at the World Bank in accordance with the criteria in the decision, and parties will need to nominate and agree on the membership of the board of the fund, which has planned its first meeting by the end of April, slightly delayed, but hopefully that will take place very soon. The board must make several decisions, including on the donor base for the fund, the eligibility criteria for accessing finance, to select an executive director and a host country for the board, and to develop a resource mobilization strategy, among many others. Another issue to consider is whether and how to include loss and damage in the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, the NCQG. And it is also worth noting that the third and final Glasgow dialogue will take place at SB60 in June this year, giving parties and non-party stakeholders an opportunity to discuss issues relevant for how to ensure the rapid disbursements of fund to address loss and damage in an impactful way for those countries that are particularly vulnerable, because that is the ultimate goal going forward. And thank you so much for your attention, and Carver, back to you.
Thank you so much, Kat, for that very helpful reminder of what we achieved, or what the world achieved just a few months ago, although it already seems a long time ago, but I think that was a timely reminder. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to welcome Sue Binyas, who's also a very close friend. I'm glad to say she's the Principal Deputy Special Envoy for Climate at the US State Department, and for over 25 years, she's played a central role in major international climate negotiations, including, of course, the Paris Agreement. Sue, looking back, it's really hard to believe how far we've come, both on loss and damage finance, compared to just a few years ago. It's really, to me at least, it's both amazing and surprising how far we've come in those few years. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts as to the reasons for that progress, and also what the US priorities for loss and damage finance and loss and damage more generally are for 2024. Over to you, Sue.
Well, thanks, Kaveh, and thanks to C2ES for pulling us all together. I was thinking about it, and you're so right about how the loss and damage issue has progressed over the last several years in, quite a short amount of time. Thinking back to the road to Paris and Paris itself, we were debating whether to address loss and damage inside the Paris Agreement as opposed to dealing with it in the decision. And assuming it was going to be addressed in the agreement itself, we were debating whether it was a subset of adaptation, whether there was overlap between adaptation and loss and damage, or whether it was sort of beyond adaptation in a completely separate category. And this was relevant to whether there would be a separate article on loss and damage, and also whether there would be titles in the Paris Agreement. And as many of you probably know, but maybe some of you don't, the reason there are no titles in the Paris Agreement was to, preserve some ambiguity about the exact relationship between adaptation and loss and damage. And, at that time, along with many others, I suspect I would never have dreamed that just a few short years later, we would not only be kind of treating loss and damage as its own thing, but agreeing on, loss and damage funding arrangements and a new fund. Now, why, you ask? I had three reasons. I'm sure there are more. One was, of course, the increase in climate impact since 2015, obviously. Second is the voices of the most vulnerable countries, including the SIDS and LDCs, have become, stronger and stronger over these years. And from a particularly US perspective, I guess the third reason would be that we have, it's been critical to make crystal clear that the discussions about finance related to loss and damage, are about cooperation. And I think this was maybe Ambassador Mo's language, cooperation and facilitation, not liability or compensation. It was certainly the kind of, I would say, deft handling of this issue in Sharm el-Sheikh, both with respect to the agenda item and the decision itself, that kind of enabled this this issue to go forward and, at least satisfy our concern on that score. So then you ask about 2024 and what needs to be done. So let me divide it into a couple chunks. First, with respect to the new fund, I'd say, agreeing with others, the board needs to make several decisions: naming the new fund, adopting the rules of procedure, developing the work plan, selecting an executive director, and more, all kinds of, housekeeping issues. Second, the fund, in order to begin the disbursement, we need to figure out how the fund is going to work. And that's going to rely, heavily on the allocation system and the disbursement approach. Our view for a long time has been that it can't operate on a first come, first served basis. That just wouldn't work. That you have, let's say a loss and damage type disaster, and then you take a huge chunk of the money. I mean, we need to figure out a more rational system. It needs to work for the most vulnerable, and the board basically needs to figure out exactly, how the allocation and disbursement systems are going to work. Next, the board needs to ensure that it is able to receive, or that the fund is able to receive, contributions from non-sovereign sources, including alternative sources. And I think this is pretty critical given the scale of the challenge. And finally, the board needs to make sure that the conditions that everybody agreed on in Dubai are met by the World Bank. So, that's kind of in a nutshell what needs to be done with respect to the new fund. Now, of course, the new fund is only one piece of the so-called mosaic of the broader funding arrangements or architecture. And there, we would say that we need to be thinking about opportunities to improve other pieces of the loss and damage funding architecture. I'll name just a couple. One would be how the GCF, the GEF, and the Adaptation Fund are promoting the inclusion of climate-induced migration and refugees in their funded activities, how humanitarian organizations are scaling up anticipatory action, and how the Santiago Network is progressing in catalyzing technical assistance for particularly vulnerable developing countries. So that's kind of the, fund plus, the larger architecture. Another area that I wanted to touch on, because loss and damage is not just about funding, is the issue of sea level rise and related policies. And here I would note that the US has articulated new policies in the last couple of years on both maritime zones and statehood. Last fall, President Biden announced a new policy that human-induced sea level rise should not cause any country to lose its statehood or its membership in the UN or specialized agencies or other international organizations. And this built upon an earlier, like 1 year before, policy with respect to maritime zones, where we said the US believes that sea level rise driven by human-induced climate change should not diminish maritime zones on which island states and other coastal states rely, including for food and livelihoods. So I know there are different legal views on both of these subjects, but we continue to think that we could kind of, as a world, advance common policies for the benefit of island states and coastal states without prejudicing anybody's legal views. So that would be another area where we could potentially make progress this year. And last but not least, of course, we need to do as much as possible on mitigation and adaptation in order to minimize and avert loss and damage in the first place. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Kaveh.
Thank you very much, Sue, for a really clear and excellent sort of articulation of the tasks at hand. And you touched on a key one, which is how do we get the fund up and running so it's actually dispersing? And a couple of things you touched on really resonated, that it shouldn't be a first come, first serve, because that would sort of prejudice maybe countries with less capacity to engage. So that needs some thinking. A number of other issues, particularly the point you made about the fund plus the reference to the Santiago Network. We have Animesh from UNDRR who will speak to this later, but also your point about President Biden saying that sea level rise shouldn't result in loss of statehood or maritime zones. This was something that the UN Secretary General raised when I was in his team back in 2019. So all really important points, and we hope to come back to those. I would remind people, if they have questions or comments, please use the Q&A function, and we'll try to pose those to the panelists at the end once we've heard from them all. So we're going to move next to the next two speakers. Played a vital role in the transitional committee that led to the COP28 outcome on loss and damage. So Uti Honkatuki, I've just realized, Uti, I've never said your surname because we've known each other so long. I only call you Uti, but Uti is the EU's lead negotiator for finance technology and capacity building. She's also the director of climate policy unit in Finland's environment ministry, and she was co-chair of the transitional committee. So Uti, I'm just wondering, I mean, Sue touched on a lot of things that were forward-looking there. I wonder if we could just take you back a little bit and ask for your reflections on the transitional committee process that led to that historic agreement at COP28, which none of us were really expecting to be agreed on the first day, which really speaks very highly of your and Richard's work, but also the COP28 presidency. And are there any lessons learned there for getting the board up and running, which is one of the things that Sue highlighted that we need to get done? So over to you, Uti. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kaveh, and thanks for inviting. And good to see you, Richard. I haven't seen you since last whatever. Anyway, so some reflections. I think I probably blocked out or blacked out some of them, some of the events, and I think really sort of looking back, the ultimate low point in my experience was at the end of the fourth meeting of the transitional committee when in Aswan, because we all thought we would end the work there and then not being able to conclude and realizing that there's going to be yet another meeting that we need to prepare for and actually get an outcome. I think that was the most difficult point for me. But anyway, so I wanted to share with you very quickly sort of 10 reflections and also trying to look a bit about, you know, what would be the lessons learned for the board. So the first lesson, absolutely, you need to have a clear mandate. You need to have a time-bound process and a clear timeline. And once you know where you need to get to at the end, you can kind of try to work backwards as to where you need to be during that year. Second point is that having a limited membership helps. So you really have a manageable size of the group. I think, and this is, you know, while we benefited a lot from the advisors of the members and the big all of the expertise there. However, sort of not having shared seats and having a rotation of people coming in, going out, and a large group of advisors wasn't always something that helped us make progress. Third point, obviously, you need to choose your co-chairs very wisely. And again, I guess I'm really biased there, but you need to have a pair of co-chairs that work well together, that trust each other, that have a sort of a shared vision of how the work would go forward, and also who can sort of complement each other. And I think sort of Richard and I, we have different strengths. So I think we were, in the end of the day, I think we worked quite well together. Fourth point, be prepared for the workload. And I certainly wasn't prepared at all for the workload. It was way more than what I expected, but also get organized and draw on the right set of expertise. And here I think we were very lucky to have several members with very strong legal expertise or sort of advisors. Very good at drafting and especially on the legal side. And I'm not going to name any names because you know who you are. Then the fifth point, be prepared. Things will not go as planned. You know, and at the outset when I agreed to be the co-chair, I thought we were going to have 3 meetings of 2 or 3 days each. So I'll be out of the office for about 10 days. And it turned out to be a total of 5 meetings. A lot of the meetings were
Uti, I think we've lost signal there slightly. Can you hear us? Uti, I think we've lost you. We'll come back to you, but I'm going to hand over to your able co-chair. You said, Uti, that it's important to choose co-chairs wisely, and the fact that that we did end up with that historic outcome, I think, sort of vindicates the choices. And your partner in that achievement was Richard Sherman, who's a member of the delegation of South Africa and was also the co-chair of the Transition Committee. He also serves as one of the Africa Group lead coordinators on climate finance negotiations, which is going to be very key this year, and was a member of the Standing Committee on Finance. And Richard is a member of the Loss and Damage Fund board. Richard, given that you are a member of the board, do you have any insights on how the board will function, and some of those points that Uti was making about consistent membership, and the points that Sue was making about needing to meet some of the criteria for the World Bank to be host? It would be really good to understand your insights and what the main tasks are for this year in terms of getting the board up and running into a place where we can actually start getting the money to the countries that need it. Over to you, Richard.
Great, thank you very much, Kaveh, and thank you for inviting me to join this webinar. And Uti, nice to see you virtually. It's been a while, but we're getting back to work now slowly. Look, the COP-CMA decision is very clear on what the board needs to do. We've done an assessment of all the mandates that we couldn't conclude in the transitional committee and that were given to the board. There are well over 35 specific policy mandates that need to be wrapped up, but some of them are really contingent on the World Bank accepting the invitation to the offer, the invitation to host the Secretariat, as well as then the board having the legal personality through a host country selection process that will enable the board to enter into a hosting agreement with the World Bank. So without those, nothing really happens. So what the board has to do is to sequence its work to allow for multiple streams to happen at the same time, and hopefully the decision to locate the Secretariat as a new dedicated independent component inside the World Bank will pay off. We will have the policy competency that we've sort of struggled with in other funds where it's taken much longer. We don't have the luxury of spending 4 or 5 years developing a resource allocation strategy or a policy or going through detailed eligibility criteria. So that really gets to the crux of the issue, is that this board has to be very different. Okay? It needs to, its primary function is to be accountable to the parties, to the convention and the Paris Agreement, and to ensure that the World Bank services the developing country parties that are particularly vulnerable, including Africa, in order to fulfill that. So therefore the board needs to be, it can't become a bottleneck, but it can't become a gatekeeper. It needs to be innovative. It needs to understand that it might be better in responding and addressing to loss and damage to not be policy prescriptive. So we're not going to have a policy that responds to a disaster in Antigua and Barbuda at the same time, that same policy being relevant to South Africa or Egypt. So we need to be able to, I would argue, rather than being policy prescriptive, we would rather have a principled approach to policies and allow the Secretariat to manage the Executive Director, which we have to appoint as the board to actually manage the funds. And that way, we should be able to respond in time, much quicker, respond to the needs of developing countries, and respond to the very peculiar events that are going to happen that make our response is different. So I'm hoping that the board doesn't get bogged down into sort of what we saw in other funds, where there's been the board is the authority, but it doesn't necessarily need to decide on every single element of its policy approach. The tools, the principle is that the tools are available to all developing countries for them to respond as they need it. So my hope is really that from the first meeting at the end of April, we get back on track to this sort of principle-based approach to addressing loss and damage, and find a good relationship between the Secretariat in the World Bank and the board, and allow things to happen. So those would be my main takeaways from the 10 years of experience in the Green Climate Fund, which we don't want to repeat, but we're very happy with the GCF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And it's good that you're on the board to take that experience forward this year. And your point's really well taken on the issues of the board needing to get down to work quickly on its mandated task, the idea of multiple work streams, but also trying to move to that principle-based approach from the end of this month. So hopefully we will see that come to fruition. I'm going to go to Ambassador Mo at the end of the panel so that he gets the honor of wrapping up the initial remarks a little bit. So it would be nice for having Sue having opened and Mo to close. So next I'm going to go to Mikai Robertson, who is a research fellow within the Climate and Sustainability Program at ODI. And as you will all know, he served as the senior advisor for finance and a lead climate finance negotiator to the Association of Small Island Developing States, and was also a member of the Loss and Damage Committee. So, Mikai, the small islands were key to pushing the agenda on loss and damage finance. When do you expect to see the money being dispersed from the new fund, and what are the main barriers to that happening, and how can we overcome them? So over to you, Mikai.
Thanks a lot, Kaveh, for inviting me. So I think the first one on when to expect money to be dispersed, I think it'd be good to get some historical context of other similar funds. So, for example, the World Bank, its articles of agreement were adopted in 1944. Its first loan to France was issued in 1947, so about 3 years after. The GCF's governing instrument was adopted in 2011. Its first board meeting was in late August 2012, and then its first project was approved in November 2015. So again, roughly around 3 years there. The pandemic fund is probably, I guess, the more recent example of similar-ish styled fund that's to the loss and damage fund, where it is a financial intermediary fund of the World Bank, but with a different sort of status and governance structure. Its first board meeting was September 22, and then roughly around 1 year after, in July 23, it, from my understanding, awarded its first grant. So really and truly, Kaveh, it all depends on, as highlighted by many of the different other panelists, is the workflow and the collegiate manner of the board, as well, noting that there were delays in the nomination that were highlighted early on by you, but as well the dynamic between the World Bank and its secretariat primarily and the board itself in negotiations, as highlighted by Richard. So all of these different things. So optimistically, potentially you could see the end of 2025, right? And that's very, very ambitious, but I know that there's some really great individuals on that board that will be working hard to get money to those who need it the most. But then, looking at it realistically, it could be at the end of 2027. All that to say barriers. Looking at 26, sorry. All that to say barriers and how do we overcome them? So I agree with Richard's point on sequencing. That's quite clear, and there's certain things that need to happen, and he alluded to them. But I would say that these are not really barriers, but required steps that are needed in order for us to disperse based off experience of similar funds. So that at a minimum, these things need to be in place. So even looking at the kind of the hiring process, as Sue highlighted, of the selection of the leader, right? The executive director of this fund, the discussion on the right leader for the right time in the fund's sort of history and process is going to be very important and crucial. In addition to that, things like ensuring that you have a secretariat that based on the discussion is geographically, is gender balanced, right? Is focused on cultural and linguistic diversity is going to be very important. So there are a couple other policy things to kind of highlight. So things like Richard again alluded to, so the investment framework. So it's discussing what to finance, right, in the governing of this loss, right? And you look at it from the perspective of whether it be, the sort of temporary loss that's faced or the permanent loss that's faced. Are you recovering to certain things, rehabilitating, sort of restoring or sort of balancing out and ensuring mobility? Then, that's in the context of the permanent loss, but then as well the temporary loss, but in the context of things that are permanently lost. How do you replace something that is permanently lost? How do you institute potentially alternatives because they provide certain services, right, to the world? How do you recognize that? All of these things have different costs attached to it. And then on the other end of that is how do you measure results? How do you track the progress of governing this loss, which is also very important, and how you frame that and articulate that and take into consideration the non-economic value of loss as well as the economic value of loss is going to be crucial, looking at it both from the human system perspective and the natural society perspective, natural systems perspective. I think the only other couple of things to highlight is that there is going to be a discussion on the screening process for how do you have different entities that can essentially access money from the fund. So this is the term that was in the governing instrument, is functional equivalence, and how you unpack that and the complexities of that and ensure that we don't have a discussion and a rehashing of things like the accreditation process, etc. And so last thing I'd just highlight is on ways to overcome these barriers, because there's many different things that we could still discuss from a policy perspective. But the first thing is to keep the affected humans and ecosystems that are faced with this loss and damage in the forefront of one's mind, whichever stakeholder you are in the process. And then the last thing is to respect that this fund was created on one legal regime that is accountable to and under the guidance of a specific group of parties, right? And is governed and supervised by an independent board. So that's one thing. But then there is that sort of antagonistic sort of role in the context of the fund is expected to be supervised by another entity under another legal regime. And so I think a level of grace and deference in the negotiations, but respecting those clear legal boundaries are going to be crucial in overcoming all of these steps. So thanks a lot, Kavi.
Thanks, Mikhail. Lots of good stuff there, including that last point on the legal relationship, about which I think a lot could be said. From the lots of things that you said there are a couple of things really struck out to me. The sort of learning the lessons from how long it's taken to get previous funds up and running, which was quite sobering. The sort of average that you came up with, where there was about 3 years. So let's see whether the board can do better and not repeat the same issues. So you talked about things like not repeating the problems of access that we've had in other fora, and thinking about the screening process. So lots of important things there that you've raised. I'd like to now move over to Animesh Kumar, because aside from loss and damage funding, COP28 agreed that UNDRR and UNOPS would host the Secretariat of the Santiago Network. And this is something that Sue mentioned in her intervention. The Santiago Network, of course, is tasked to provide technical assistance regarding averting and minimizing and addressing loss and damage. I have the pleasure to turn to Animesh, who's the head of the UNDRR office in Bonn and manages the organization's global unit for climate action and monitoring of the Sendai framework, early warnings for all, and it was also integral to the process to agree the Santiago Network. Animesh, what do you see as the main priorities for the Santiago Network, and what are the main linkages, if any, between the network and the new fund? So over to you in Bonn, Animesh. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaveh, and it's definitely good to be in the company of some very familiar faces who have played a key role in shaping the loss and damage architecture. Sue did mention that loss and damage mechanisms are not just about funding, and that comes the focus on capacity gaps that we often observe in terms of developing vulnerable countries, in terms of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And that is what the focus of the Santiago Network is. And it's unique in the sense that it does not simply focus on capacity building from external international organizations, but the focus is on catalyzing the technical assistance of organizations, bodies, networks, and experts. And it's a very critical step for capacity retention in such countries. People are already aware the network was launched in COP25, COP26 in Glasgow agreed on its functions, COP27, governance arrangements, and COP28, we as UNDRR, together with our colleagues in UNOPS, were identified as the hosts of the Secretariat of the Santiago Network. Now, soon after the COP28, we have already signed the MOU on this process and moving forward very quickly. We just have had 3 weeks back the first advisory board meeting of the Santiago Network, where Geneva was selected as a seat of the Secretariat. And I also see there are some questions on this. So yeah, there will be regional outposts of Santiago Network Secretariat that will also be established for enhanced outreach. Now, as the host as well as currently the interim secretariat, our key priorities are in terms of ensuring that technical assistance needs are identified, prioritized, and communicated. And this can be done if we have the right facilitation of the knowledge in terms of development, its provision, dissemination, as well as exchange. Considering the fact that the technical assistance will not just be provided by international organizations, but a body of experts and networks, it's very important to identify them. And the Santiago Network can thus become a convener of different relevant stakeholders and non-state actors in terms of identification of expertise to avert, minimize, and addressing loss and damage. And in that context, the coordination with existing Warsaw International Mechanism governance mechanisms like the Executive Committee, and also its expert groups and task forces is very important. Now, one thing which I would definitely want to highlight is the catalytic function, which is the hallmark of Santiago Network. As I already mentioned, that technical assistance from the Santiago Network is just not about helicopter missions, but in terms of ensuring that capacity is retained. And one of the ways through which catalytic function can be ensured is through ensuring that there is enhanced access to resources by and through better capacities, both within and outside the Convention and the Paris Agreement. So for us, the key next step is in terms of moving forward very quickly, immediately following the first board meeting, in terms of establishing the full secretariat, working with the board to establish the rules of procedure, developing different guidance on designation of the service providers and the organizations as members of the Santiago networks, also establishing procedures for responding to requests and for technical assistance, and collaborating with different other mechanisms like XCOM, as well as the Loss and Damage Fund and funding arrangements. Now, that brings us to the second part in terms of the linkages with the Loss and Damage Fund. Now, the COP28 decision, both on the Loss and Damage Fund as well as on the Santiago network, calls upon better collaboration between the two mechanisms. And it very clearly states that the alignment of technical assistance under the Santiago network with the programmatic approaches of the fund is of critical importance. It's also need to be mentioned in terms of the countries to be able to utilize technical assistance that targets special gaps or specific gaps that need to be addressed to best design and access financial resources from a wide range of sources. That can be facilitated through the Santiago network, wherein one of the primary sources of funding could be Loss and Damage Fund. Now, what does the technical assistance mechanism from Santiago network and the programmatic approach of the Loss and Damage Fund looks like is something which perhaps can be discussed at best at the forthcoming dialogues under the fund, and as well as the consultative mechanisms that will be further followed. But any feedback on this will be further welcome. One thing which I also want to point out before I conclude is what are the key next steps that are very important when countries have at their disposal these multiple financial mechanisms and commitments and Loss and Damage Fund. And one thing which is of a bit of concern is the absorptive capacity of developing countries in managing all these different mechanisms. And I would point to three key areas where little investment can lead to better outcomes at the end. One is in context of data. We need better assessment methodologies and tools to know the impact, prioritize the areas for financing. And to understand the financing needs on loss and damage, we need to understand the level of loss and damage, which we often don't know. And if we can't quantify the levels of losses we face, we can't monetize it. Hence, investment in data is of critical importance. The second is that we have now global policy and related funding instruments. However, the landing spots of these different global frameworks in a country is often not the same. And that leads to lack of institutional coordination, which I think is of critical importance moving forward. And that leads to the third point in terms of policy coherence, that multiple planning and policy instruments have different aims on implementation, and there is a critical need for comprehensive risk management, which was highlighted under Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, and then subsequently at the GST, in terms of ensuring that risk becomes a common basis for implementation, and hence all these funding mechanisms can collaborate better for generating and building resilience. Back to you, Kaveh, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Animesh, and congratulations to UNDR and UNOPS, and really wish you the best to get the network up and running. It's something that was a little bit backstage in terms of the focus of attention at COP28, but both from the interventions of Mikhail, Sue, and others, it seems that the network could play a really important role in getting the fund up and running and also dispersing to countries in a way that's effective. You also mentioned that catalytic role, but also important areas of better data, the need for in-country coordination from different external sources of funding, but also policy coordination on risk. So the network will be very important in terms of turning potential funding flows into actually really positive impacts. So definitely good luck with that. I'd now like to turn to Sarah Miller. We will come back to Ambassador Mo at the end of the panel to have some remarks. If people in the audience have questions, do pose them and comments. I think you can also like those comments if you're in the audience. So the ones which are most popular will float to the top. That doesn't necessarily mean that those were the ones I'll choose, but it will be influential. So Sarah Miller, who is the program director for the Climate Emergency Collaboration Group and a very long-term friend of mine, longer than I'd like to admit because it makes me feel old. Because Sarah worked at the heart of the COP process for many years with the UK government, leading its international stakeholder engagement from the Copenhagen COP in 2009 through to Paris. Sarah, a key deliverable for COP29 in Azerbaijan will be the new collective quantified goal. This is already starting to dominate the discourse on climate change this year. What do you see as the relationship between the Loss and Damage Fund and funding arrangements and the NCQG, if any? So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Kaveh, and thank you to C2ES. This is such a fantastic panel and such a great discussion to be having. I think, as you say, I think everybody is widely expecting COP29. It's already been billed as the finance COP. But I think taking a step back even further from that, I think certainly within the philanthropic community of which I'm a part, the discussion is very much around this being a finance year more generally. And you know, the NCQG is a huge part of that. But we've also got, you know, we've heard from much better qualified panelists than I, talking about all of the work that we have to do this year around the Loss and Damage Fund and the funding arrangements. And we've also got conversations around adaptation finance. And then layered on top of that, we've got really big conversations happening around global financial reform and global financial architecture. And I think because of the COP, because of COP29, because of the mandate that we have to deliver there, the NCQG is almost a prism for all of that other work. And of course, you know, 2024 is also the year of elections, and having finance conversations in a year of elections, and some quite difficult elections in certain parts of the world, it makes it even more of a tension, and I think, and there's an awful lot of work to be done between now and the end of the year when we arrive in Baku. So I think the NCQG is the link for all of those pieces. It is the prism, and it is a really important signal for all of those other finance conversations. So in terms of the linkages, I don't think they could be stronger. I think as well, you know, the NCQG conversation, it provides an opportunity for a consolidation of some of those finance asks, particularly coming from the global south. I think, you know, certainly some of the organisations that we work with and that we provide resource and support for, they see it as an opportunity to redefine and rebalance that allocation of climate finance across the piece. So they are connecting the dots. They are seeing the NCQG as part of that broader finance conversation, and most definitely linked to the loss and damage finance conversation as well. I think, you know, the way that we're seeing it is, you know, this is a highly contentious, highly political issue, and we also have a lot of political milestones to pass through this year. You know, we know that we've got 4 technical expert dialogues to go. We know that we've got 1 high-level ministerial to go, and lots of parties and non-parties have obviously spoken and referenced that high-level ministerial dialogue. You know, we expect it to be around Climate Week, to be around UNGA, and clearly having that sort of crucible of the politics, and obviously it's going to be, you know, the discussion is going to take place in the G20, it's going to take place in the G7, the UNSG is going to make it a priority. We're going to have this high-level ministerial dialogue. It's going to be part of the Summit of the Future, and I think to try and unpick
the loss and damage part of that bigger finance conversation in that kind of political crucible is going to be incredibly difficult. You know, even if people wanted to do it, and I'm not suggesting that people would want to, although people can make their own minds up about that, it would be incredibly difficult to do so. I think, you know, again, people will have read the NCQG submissions. There are particular groups that have mentioned the fact that they want to have a conversation about loss and damage in the context of the NCQG, in the context of what the potential structure might look like. They are referencing it in you know, and talking about paragraph 9, Article 9, paragraph 4 of the Paris Agreement. You know, they are linking it. You know, they want to talk about mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And so, you know, it's very unlikely that someone isn't going to mention it in these political moments, and therefore, I think the link will definitely be there. I also think the link will be there because it's an issue of trust for an awful lot of parties and an awful lot of stakeholders in these conversations. I don't think it's any secret that, you know, we've had a bit of a sticky time getting to the 100 billion. And you know, we could have a variety of views on whether we've met it, whether the OECD report will validate that we met it in 2022 or 2023. I think towards the end of this year. We know that we've had difficulty meeting our obligations around adaptation finance as well. And, you know, we've heard a lot of great stuff about, you know, the historic outcome at both COP27 agreeing to the fund, and then the operationalization, and also, you know, efforts to make pledges to the new fund at COP28. The quantum, you know, $700 million there or thereabouts is not to be sniffed at, but it's in no way, shape or form anywhere near, you know, some of the estimates that are actually required in relation to the need around losses and damages. And so, you know, this issue of trust, the fact that we haven't met some of our previous obligations, I think, you know, a lot of the stakeholders that we work with think that the NCQG not talking about loss and damage and not having different sub goals is very much an issue of trust or lack thereof. So for us in the philanthropy world, thinking about some of the people that we work with, I think, you know, COP29, the NCQG, it will be very, very much around making those links, talking about, you know, in other fora, innovative sources. And I know in some of the submissions, certainly some developed parties have talked about innovative sources. The fact that they've invoked that for a lot of different stakeholders, that implies a conversation about loss and damage. Because when we've talked about loss and damage, we've talked about the fund and the funding arrangements and where the money is going to come from, and innovative sources have clearly been a big plank of that conversation. I also think that you know, the numbers that we're talking about here, you know, we've got sort of figures around sort of 6 trillion to implement the NDCs. We've got NCQG targets set by you know, different parties in the submissions that they've done around $1 trillion. These numbers are huge. You know, if you talk to some of the civil society organizations, that the quantum that they're talking about, you know, is $192 trillion. You know, I think a quick Google might suggest that, you know, I'm not sure there's $192 trillion in the world. But, you know, these numbers, they almost don't mean anything until you sort of start carving out a little bit around, you know, what do those numbers mean? Where would the money go? What would it be for? And I think that, again, implies a bit of a conversation around some of it surely must be for loss and damage. Some of it must be for adaptation. Some of it will be for mitigation, and sort of carving out those pockets and those sub goals, I think is inevitable. And I'll go back to the trust element. We surely can't have a situation where, you know, we're going to be at the limits of 1.5. The UK Met Office, for example, has suggested that 2024 will be the year that we see the sort of official breach. And if we're not thinking about, finance for mitigation, if we haven't done enough mitigation, that we're avoiding a 1.5 degree centigrade breach, and then if we're not providing adaptation finance, and we're not talking about loss and damage finance in the context of the finance conversation this year at COP, I think there will be some very disappointed, very angry and frustrated participants in those negotiations, which will make it more difficult to get a successful outcome at COP29, and certainly thinking about the springboard for 2025 and the implementation of the NDCs, which I think we've got numbers around 6 trillion to implement them as well. So yeah, there most definitely are interlinkages. I think a COP outcome that doesn't address loss and damage finance on the NCQG will leave a bitter taste. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. That's it's really helpful to have that sort of context setting of the political headwinds, geopolitical headwinds, economic headwinds that we face this year. And in some ways, while COP29 is much simpler in terms of the number of issues on the table than COP28, I think politically the challenge for the Azerbaijan presidency is high. But you've also rightly pointed out that a positive outcome is essential to set that context for what's going to come next, which is the new NDCs in the first quarter. And of course, there's conversations as to whether the NCQG should have windows for things like loss and damage and adaptation. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, trying to separate out those issues probably wouldn't be very fruitful. So lots of important things. And also the important thing that you mentioned, that while it was quite extraordinary to be in that opening plenary at COP29, where we saw countries coming in with 100 million pledges, and I think by the second day of the COP, we'd had 700 million, which is historic. What we don't have is anywhere near the quantum that's necessary to deal with this issue. And it seems like the NCQG, if it's going to be effective, will need to have that conversation between getting to that 6 trillion this decade, but also what is the implementable role of public finance, and what will be the donor base for that public finance, which is necessarily only going to be a fraction of that quantum. So lots of questions in the Q&A. Please do keep posing them. There's lots of friends and familiar people in the audience, including former ministers, among others. So please do pose some questions. So we have lots of questions in the chat. I'm going to go to those now. We have one from Megan Rowling, which is from Climate Home News, which is seems to be very popular. And the question is, if allocation of the fund is not going to work on a first come, first served basis, what's the prevailing thinking on how funds, which will be limited, can be allocated fairly, as needs are going to be so much higher than resources? So I wonder whether that might be something I could pose to Mikhail, because Mikhail, you mentioned that, and also maybe Sue, I could go to you, because you actually said at the beginning that it shouldn't be on a first come, first served basis. So maybe Sue first. Do you have any thoughts, if it's not first come, first serve, how could we allocate fairly?
Thanks, Kaveh. It's a good question. It's exactly why I raised it as something the board needs to grapple with. I think our concern with first come, first serve is if, let's say, you had an extreme weather event that required a certain amount of money to address, and that's almost the amount of money in the fund or some sizable chunk of it, it really wouldn't be fair to the other countries if you just wiped out X% of the fund, given the sort of almost coincidence that a particular event happened at the front end of the existence of the fund. So that's, we were trying to think that you need a fairer way of distributing an amount of money that's probably not going to be as large as the need, at least in the initial stages. What exactly that allocation is, I think, needs to be determined, but it also needs to, I think, give weight to the most vulnerable countries, because that was sort of the prevailing principle of the fund. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sue. Mikhail, did you want to come in on that point as well?
Yeah, can you hear me, Kaveh?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess in the drafting of the governing instrument, there is a paragraph that at least alludes to 5 factors that should be taken into account when developing that system. And it's the factors are, first of all, needs and priorities of developing countries. The second is sort of a point on scale, circumstances, relativity. So the scale of a particular climatic event relative to the national circumstances, which could include the capacity, right? So that's one factor as well. The third one is the safeguarding against overconcentration, which Sue highlighted too. That was one thing that was designed, at least one of the factors, which does talk about overconcentration, whether it be in country, region, etc., group of countries. The fourth one is the best available science and databases to try and get over these issues with, what was at least poorly termed as the climate rationale in the Green Climate Fund, which actually was about impact potential, and what potentially forms the basis of that, is also that consideration. Then the kind of the fourth thing was on the estimates of addressing costs, so the cost estimates. And then the last thing was the minimum allocation floor for LDCs and SIDS, which still needs to be determined in line with, and how all these other factors, and actually that was, I said needs, relativity, overconcentration is 3, information is 4, estimates is 5. It's actually 6, sorry. So there's actually 6 main factors, and how you balance those things together is highly important. And the last thing is that a concept that was highlighted and alluded to, but I'm sure will come up again in the board discussions, is how do you reconcile programmatic access to the fund versus trigger-based access to the fund. And I know that the board will be, there was initial discussions in the TC level, but I know the board will intelligently sort of interact with that, noting that there's a finite amount of resources that will have to balance out. So board members who are there can probably kind of like speak to that as well. So I hope that's okay, Kavi. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Mikhail. Lots of different considerations and criteria that you set out there, and also from Sue, which all points to what Richard was saying earlier about how essential it is for the board to get up and running quickly, but also to have multiple tracks so it doesn't just get bogged down in process. I think the thing that's coming through very clearly from the panel is that everybody wants these funds to be dispersed as quickly as possible, which I think is really good news. We have a question from Inesh Bakhtawi. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And the question is, what will be the process to verify whether the World Bank is a suitable host for the fund? What accountability systems will be set up? I'm going to ask Richard to address that, if that's okay with you, Richard, because you're on the board. An important and good question, given that the choice of the World Bank was controversial among some of the parties. So, Richard, if you're there, would you like to take that one?
Sure, Kaveh, let me try. So we've already decided to offer an invitation to the bank, subject to conditions that need to be met. Those conditions themselves were part of a statement released by developing countries on the final day of TC5, right? So we had accepted that there was an overriding logic of going to the World Bank, despite many of our members not wanting the World Bank. And so now the first deadline is the 12th of June. The World Bank board itself has to confirm its acceptance of the invitation, and then its acceptance of the conditions. And then essentially what would happen is by August, the board would then have to confirm in the hosting agreement with the World Bank, which is the main accountability mechanism between the COP CMA and the World Bank itself as the secretariat, that these conditions will be met. Now, let's just say, I think, well, I hope we took the right decision. The initial indications from the bank is that they have a different opinion. So yesterday's World Bank board meeting was meant to endorse the World Bank staff paper. That was then turned into an informal meeting because the Loss and Damage Fund board had met last week Friday informally and expressed concerns about the World Bank's approach. So hopefully this is just a minor roadblock in our relationship with the World Bank. And I do believe that we took the right decision to put it into the World Bank, because we want a fund that can respond really quickly and rapidly. So no project cycles, no program cycles. If an event happens, either there's a trigger-based system or there's another way of a system where it can release money quickly, and the World Bank can do that through its direct policy lending approaches or direct budget support. So that's what's different about this fund. So let's see. We have the World Bank board has asked the World Bank staff to consult with the Loss and Damage Fund board, and I assume we will have this as an agenda item on our end of April, early May board meeting, and we'll proceed from there. If we fail to resolve the matter with the relationship with the World Bank, then the COP decision, the COP CMA decision is very clear that we would exit, and we would then proceed on the path of establishing a new international organization, which sounds nice and which has been our preferred option, but it's going to take even longer than the 2026 disbursement that Makai had mentioned. So let's see how it plays out. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Hopefully that answered Inesh's question. I've got another board-related question here that I might pose to Uti. It's a second question from Megan Rowling of Climate Home, where she asks, what is the situation with respect to the final board member who has yet to be named? When and how will that be resolved? And what's the issue there? Uti, if you're there, I'd welcome you to take that. Otherwise, I may throw that also back to Richard. Over to you, Uti. Okay, I don't think we have Uti. Richard, would you mind taking that question as well? And then after that, Sarah, I'm going to ask you a question that's been posed to you in the chat. So Richard, on that remaining board member, are we waiting for the board to be operational, or is it already operational?
So technically it's not. I mean, right now the board has been nominated. There is one seat that still needs to be nominated, but that seat is a shared seat between the country is not represented in regional subgroups of the G77, right? So there is an alternate seat, which is India. So the board can be fully constituted with voting seats at this point in time for the first meeting in April. And these are subgroup regional discussions that are happening amongst parties, and they will resolve it. I'm not aware of what the problems are, but there are difficult decisions to be made in groups. There's a limited number of seats, but our understanding is that the board is going ahead with a full constituency, full representation of members. And we'll then, once we meet physically, there's no decision that we confirm the nominations. We've been nominated, and we will meet, and we'll have a quorum, and we'll adopt our agenda, and everything should be fine for end of April. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. Hopefully that's answered that question. We have a question here from Luna Peterson. Thanks for a great webinar. We've seen that a lot of current climate finance is diverted from development finance. According to the COP28 decision, loss and damage finance should be new and additional, but unless it's clearly defined what constitutes new and additional, and isn't there a large risk that loss and damage finance will be diverted from existing funds? I think that's a very important question, and probably one that PhD theses could be written about. I wonder who on the panel would like to take that if we let you ruminate on that. But in the meantime, we also have a specific question for Sarah from Cinziana Pushkash. So Sarah, in your view, is the NCQG more of an aspirational goal to drive ambition, or do we expect it to be an operational mechanism with implementation links to funds? So Sarah, if you could take that question, and if I could ask if anyone on the panel would like to take that question about new and additional. Sarah, over to you.
It's a really great question, and I've looked at it in the chat, and I've pondered how I would respond to this. So, is it aspirational? Is it inspirational? Aspirational, yes. Inspirational, it ought to be. However, they're not. These aren't invented numbers. These aren't invented figures. You know, we've got the recommendations from the GST. We've got gap reports, or, you know, coming out of our ears on how much climate finance is required for different aspects. You know, we know how much adaptation finance is needed. We've got the original 100 billion goal. We've got the doubling of adaptation finance. We've got estimates around what's required for loss and damage. We know what the pillars should look like. We know what the NDCs will cost, and I suppose, you know, the question I would pose back is, you know, do we deliberately want to peg the NCQG to the implementation of the NDCs? And if we do, that implies a conversation about the quantum that is probably bigger than some of the numbers that have been mentioned in the submissions by some of the groups and some of the party submissions. So it shouldn't be aspirational, because, you know, these are numbers grounded in research and evidence, and, you know, where things have happened, and we know how much things cost. You know, and in previous rounds of NDCs, we've had, you know, some NDCs where they've talked about, this is what we can do on our own, this is what we can do with additional financing, with additional means of implementation. So it ought not to be aspirational, but you know, I'll go back to what I said before. It's an election year, you know, for pretty much half the world's population, and having climate finance conversations against that backdrop with some quite, you know, nasty politics probably in some parts of the world is going to be really, really hard. So the ask is going to be there, you know, and what I said earlier about the NCQG being that prism for a redefining of global South asks on climate. Will the transmission be received? Will it be well received? And I sadly suspect not, but we're all here, and we're all going to be trying really, really hard to have that framing conversation to describe the need and to describe what's required and who has responsibility for that.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Again, stressing the importance of the NCQG, and that it needs to be more than just aspirational and inspirational, but also taking on board the important context that 6 trillion is not going to be met only by public finance from a limited number of donors. That's just the reality. So I'd like to ask, I'm going to ask this of Mikhail. Again, sorry to throw you under the bus. You're really earning your spot here. But this question from Luna Peterson on the question of new and additional. I mean, this is a really difficult and open-ended question, but the decision says that the loss and damage should be a new and additional, but unless it's clearly defined, isn't there a large risk that we're just going to see funds moving from one pot to another? Would you like to address that briefly, Mikhail?
Yeah, sure, no problem, Kavi. So this is a broader issue for all aspects of climate finance. So not only loss and damage finance as a subset, but mitigation finance and adaptation finance. And it's as old as the convention itself in the 1990s. It's a live discussion right now in the NCQG, I'll tell you that, and how we go about dealing with that. And I think the essence of what, at least looking at the different sort of preparatory works behind the Rio Declaration, as well as the sort of submissions coming in from the convention, there is this understanding that development costs one thing, but when you add certain environmental degradation issues, it adds to that cost, right? And so there is the need to, I understand that there's different perspectives on it that has developed over time, but I think the more important thing is, can we be intellectually honest about what exactly we're talking about here? Because we can't say that, you know, the sustainable development issue is huge, it's massive, it's bigger than just regular development. And then while we're spending $1 on development, we're just going to shift that $1 over to, you know, climate finance and say that we're solving the issue. You know, it's an issue of double counting. It's an issue of getting the impact that is needed, because all of these things cost incrementally and additionally more money, and we shouldn't be shifting around funding. And we sadly saw that, at least generally, speculatively, when there were pledges made to the Loss and Damage Fund, the Adaptation Fund suffered quite greatly in relation to what it wanted to mobilize its resources for, right? And so we can't be engaging in that type of shifting around. It's just the cost of climate inaction. So the more that we mitigate, the more that we adapt, is the less that we need to spend on loss and damage, the less we need to spend on adaptation. And it's as simple as that. So that at least is my kind of, theological, spiritual sort of answer to new and additional. So I hope that helps, Kaveh. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Mikhail. I think a related question we have here is from Fiona Ryan, who asks, what's the definition of loss and damage, which is a big question in itself. But how is it different from humanitarian and adaptation? And I'm wondering if I could turn to Animesh, because your organization is going to be hosting the UNDRR. You mentioned the links to the Loss and Damage Fund, but it seems like the Santiago Network might have quite an important role to play in this question of the sort of coordination of different regimes, particularly within the UN. Do you have any thoughts about the difference between funding for loss and damage and for things like disaster risk reduction, migration, human rights, etc.? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kaveh. I think that's something which also needs to be further discussed, not only in the discussion context of the fund, but also the larger funding arrangements, wherein fund is one of the components. So one thing which we need to acknowledge that both humanitarian financing as it stands now and the loss and damage financing as we are discussing in this webinar as well are both very low, and hence we cannot talk about duplication at this stage, but at best how the two complement each other. And in that context, we need to understand that humanitarian financing, although it's trying to be very anticipatory, is at best very reactive in nature. So it reacts to a specific event, while addressing loss and damage can go beyond that, or can go much ex ante beyond an event. So that's something which definitely distinguishes between the two and also establishes to some extent the complementarity between the two. Also, we need to acknowledge that while humanitarian funding is often geared towards extreme or sudden events, the loss and damage financing should also focus on the slow onset events and processes, which remains a big area of gap as of now. There are no early warning systems. There are no financing attributed only for that, or lack of action remains a big issue on slow onset events. Also, the issue in terms of the understanding and quantification of losses and damages resulting from slow onset events. And then to add to the dimension, the non-economic losses. So there are huge gaps that the humanitarian actions in its conventional role doesn't cover, which is where the loss and damage financing can come in. But how this will work in the context of humanitarian architecture, if there is an extreme event and a PDNA is conducted, following which humanitarian appeals are made, how does that humanitarian appeal play around in context of the the loss and damage funding arrangement, is something which will be an interesting answer to see moving forward as well. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for that, Animesh. And actually at CTS, we did some work last year and did on a paper on the importance of the coordination of different elements and different regimes on loss and damage. And again, it seems to me that the importance of the Santiago Network in this question has really been underestimated, not by you, but I think now that the fund is operational, I think turning our attention to those questions will be really important. Harjit Singh has asked a question here, and I'm going to pose this to Richard, given his finance experience, but also Uti, if we can get her back online. So Harjit asks, although we cannot adopt a first come first served basis and we have to establish criteria, all of it in the end comes down to the question of sufficient funding, and the critical question being whether and how the fund will match the scale of the finance. I think, as was mentioned earlier, the 700 million or so capitalization was extraordinary, but it's a fraction of what is needed to minimize, avert, and address loss and damage. So how are we going to make sure that countries contribute a fair share to the finance to the fund? So Richard, given your past experience with the SCF and your membership of the board, I thought I would I would pose that really easy question for you to answer, Richard, if you're there.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So, I mean, I think this goes back to the earlier discussion that Sue and Mackay had, and I don't think it's an issue of resource allocation. I think Harjit is spot on. It's about how we access the money, how much money we have available, right? So, for example, we can't set aside money and then not spend it. So this is the adverse impact of not having a first come first serve process. So, for example, you look at the IDA private sector facility window, right? It's got money, but we can't spend it because nobody wants to use private sector money in LDCs and SIDS. So the money's sitting there. So we can't afford now to have locked up loss and damage funding and say no to people. At the same time, we recognize that we have to have a minimum allocation for LDCs and SIDS because of their particular vulnerabilities and their circumstances. So the question really is a board issue about managing the commitment authority and then making sure that developed countries as the primary supporters of this fund, not the only, but the primary supporters, give enough commitment authority on an annual basis so that the fund can actually respond. So like if you look at the GCF, it only has annual commitment authority of less than $2 billion a year, right? That's nowhere near the need. Sometimes that commitment authority it goes down to 400 million per board meeting, right? And that's just because, so we have to figure this out, is what is the financial management system of this fund. We were silent in the transitional committee, the governing instrument, on who's responsible for bearing the burden. It's everybody contributes, including innovative sources and non-sovereign sources, and that's where we are. We can continue to have this discussion in NCQG. I'm pretty sure that we would want to have that conversation, but I don't think that the outcome is going to be any different to than what we resolved in the governing instrument of the fund. So I think this is just a part of the management process. One of the core conditions that we imposed on the World Bank is that the World Bank is able to invest the loss and damage funds into other funds to make money, right? This is not just a normal trustee experience where they invest in socially responsible investments, but this is actually, you could actually have an example whereby the loss and damage fund could issue a bond for renewable energy in developing countries, and then the returns of the payments of those loans or grants or reimbursable grants can go back into fund loss and damage. So I think we have an opportunity to define a unique financial system for loss and damage. But again, the political notion of who's responsible and who pays will continue to be an element of our negotiations. And we as the board, that's not our responsibility. Our responsibility to the board is to raise money either through a replenishment or a resource mobilization strategy, and that should be our focus. Politically, the parties at the COP of the CMA at Baku and onwards can resolve the bigger issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for that, highlighting the important role of the board in terms of galvanizing the resources for the fund. And also I think the points that Sarah and others made is that the relationship to the NCQG is going to be important here, because that at COP28, the global stocktake decision basically said that developing countries need almost 6 trillion by the end of this decade to meet existing commitments. So that gives a kind of at least an idea of the scale of the figure for that issue. So it's clear that we're a long way off, and also the difficult question of donor base is going to be an important one that the board has to grapple with. I'm going to ask one final question here, and having been a small islands negotiator for AOSIS back in the day, I'm going to ask the question posed by Vijay Kasari, who I think might be from Kiribati. So he says that small island developing states like Kiribati, which is a low-lying atoll nation, are already looking for higher land in other countries, such as Fiji, to buy or shift settlements, which is a deeply sobering statement, but that's the reality. He asks, what is your opinion on whether the Loss and Damage Fund covers finance for such initiatives? And I think it would be appropriate to pose that question to Mackay. So Mackay, you have the last word here. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a lot, Kaveh, and I hope you can hear me again. So one thing I would say to that question is that if the Loss and Damage Fund cannot fund something like that, then the Loss and Damage Fund is not doing what it was originally intended to do. point back. Like it was one of the main things that we as small islands, as developing countries, highlighted in our interventions in the first Glasgow Dialogue that started this entire process. And so if the fund cannot fund these things and encourage the funding of these things, noting that they have to govern this horrible loss, then the Loss and Damage Fund deserves to be terminated, that specific part of the governing instrument. So I tasked the board with making sure that things like these are no longer risk, because they have been highlighted as risk in the context of adaptation funding, etc., because of how they view things like relocation, and especially involuntary, voluntary relocation in the context of safeguards as risk associated with projects, not the main focus and the results oriented for the project. This is why the loss and damage, one of the key points of why the Loss and Damage Fund was created, to no longer treat it as a risk, but treat it as something that you have to govern and you have to finance. And so I hope that answers my colleague from Kiribati, and it is a task to all the board members and the World Bank and the Secretariat to actually think of this in a different light. You're no longer thinking about it in the light of the current system of environmental social safeguards. While we need to be safe, we do need to think about a different way, because we are entering into the era of governing loss, sadly, but we do need to enter it and address it carefully. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Mikhail. I think the important point you made there, if the fund doesn't address issues such as those faced by Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Maldives, and others, as well as the rest of the SIDS and LDCs and other vulnerable countries, then what's the fund for? I sort of reflect back. I predicted that the Loss and Damage Fund wouldn't be agreed at COP27, and I was wrong. And I never believed that the fund would be capitalized to some extent at COP28, yet alone on the first day. So I was also wrong there. What I find really encouraging is that everybody here, we had really a spectrum of panelists, and thank you to all of them for their time. And for being with us. But what the message, the key takeaway I got is that there's a sense of urgency by everybody that the fund needs to get to the stage quickly of dispersing funds to the countries that need it. And I think that was a unifying message, which is really positive and something that I would really never have imagined even 3 years ago would be possible. So I think that's great news. So Chelsea in our team here has, who leads on loss and damage for us at CTS, has posted in the chat a link to some of the resources. We have multiple papers and resources on things like the coordinating function of the Santiago network, the role of finance, and there'll be more there this year. So please do have a look at that. We addressed many of the questions. Sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but I'd like to thank all of you from around the world in different time zones for joining us. And a final thank you to our panelists, Chelsea and Philip here at CTUS. Thank you very much for joining us.